All right, I think we're ready to start. Who would like to start us off? And you are.
Hi, my name's Dan Evans. I'm a tenant organizer at the Goddard Riverside Law Project.
Welcome.
Thank you. I want to welcome you to the Rent Guidelines Board.
Thank you.
It's exciting to have you. And also welcome to the new owner member. Nice. I look forward to meeting you both individually. So like I said, my name is Dan Evans. I'm a tenant organizer at the Goddard Riverside Law Project. Our office has provided free legal representation and organizing support with a specialization on single-room occupancy tenants on the west side of Manhattan for the past 30 years. I testified in front of this board last year, and it's a great honor to have the opportunity to address you again this afternoon concerning issues affecting SRO and Class A residential hotel tenants. We celebrate the board's vote last year in favor of a 0% increase for SROs. This was a fair decision that took into account the need to maintain rents affordable for low-income New Yorkers without compromising the ability of building owners to profit from their investments. Last year, we testified at this board regarding the lack of resources and housing alternatives most SRO tenants face if they become priced out of their homes. And we also discussed the profitable uses that owners of SRO buildings can make of their properties without renting them to permanent tenants. The conditions that warranted last year's 0% vote remain essentially unchanged. SRO tenants continue to struggle while buildings designated for residential use by rent-stabilized tenants are increasingly used for other purposes, which in turn generate significant profits in those buildings. So we hope our testimony today will compel the board to once again vote for a 0% increase for SRO tenants. To just talk briefly about conditions for SRO tenants, in looking at the 2016 income and affordability study, it's fairly alarming for low-income New Yorkers generally. It indicates that employment levels are growing, albeit slowly, but it also shows that the rate of homelessness continues to rise in New York, along with the number of New Yorkers that are dependent on public assistance. The median gross rent to income ratio for all tenants based on the 2014 housing vacancy survey is 33.8%, and it's even higher for rent-stabilized tenants. What's more disconcerting is that 33.5% of rent-stabilized tenants pay more than 50% of their household income in gross rent. And we see this with the SRO tenants that our office serves, who frequently pay a substantial portion of their modest incomes. Most of our clients are SSI, Social Security recipients, or receive shelter allowance or public assistance, and some clients, have food stamps as their sole means of income. SROs have traditionally been housing of last resort for low-income people who would otherwise be homeless. Thousands of hardworking people, as well as a disproportionate amount of elderly and disabled folks call SROs their home. If the economic situation is difficult for low-income New Yorkers, it is dire for most residents of SROs. As I said, many rely on SSI, disability pensions, food stamps, and these are their sole sources of income. And our clients have reported incomes as low, like under $10,000 per year. For many, the affordability of their SRO home means the difference between having a roof over their head and being homeless. With vacancy rates in apartments during 2014, with homelessness at a nightly average of over 57,000 persons per night, which has gone up almost 6% over the previous year, the city cannot afford to increase rents on what is truly one of the last remaining resources of affordable housing for low-income New Yorkers. With that background on SRO tenants, I'd like to talk a little bit about conditions for SRO owners. The low vacancy rates in New York City suggest that building owners have little trouble renting out their units to permanent tenants. SRO landlords, however, have found more profitable uses of their properties that will allow them to reap higher profits while depleting the availability of this affordable housing stock. These uses, they're countless, but the main ones are contracts with Department of Homeless Services, with HRA and HASA, net leasing to local colleges, and what I think is the biggest, renting to tourists, transient rentals, both legally and illegally. A report released in 2010 by the Manhattan Borough President's Office showed that almost 1,500 SRO units were lost between 1996 and 2010 on the Upper West Side alone.
Did you say 1996?
1996 and 2010. Considering the case, there's two buildings that we're actively involved with, the Pennington and the Continental on 95th Street, where the landlord has an arrangement with an operator of a homeless shelter, and they provide 200 rooms to 400 homeless families at a monthly cost to the city of $3,700 per room. While we are heartened that Comptroller Scott Stringer and Borough President Gail Brewer were able to negotiate an agreement with the Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services and DHS to reduce the shelter population to 200, these rooms could be made available to the very people that are staying in them, temporarily, as permanent, affordable, rent-stabilized tenants. Instead, the landlord is earning enormous profits by turning permanent housing into temporary shelter. The owner does not rely on rental income from the remaining permanent tenants to operate the building, nor does it need to increase the rent in order to maintain these services. Other owners are making profits both legally and illegally, renting out rent-stabilized units to tourists on a nightly or weekly basis, depending on the classification, zoning, and fire code regulations that apply to various buildings. Some SRO hotels are lawfully permitted to offer transient rentals, but the vast majority never inform those guests that they do have rights, that you can make a lease request and trigger your rights to become a permanent tenant and occupy it as your home, and become a rent-stabilized tenant. Although the strengthening of the law prohibiting illegal hotels that was passed in 2010 and increased enforcement have helped curb the practice of transient rentals to some extent, many SRO owners continue to skirt the law and charge exorbitant rates for rooms that have legal rents that would be affordable for low-income New Yorkers. One example you may have heard, there's been getting a lot of press lately, is the Imperial Court. It is a residential SRO building on West 79th Street that bills itself as a extended stay hotel. Nonetheless, it still lists daily rates for rooms on its websites that correlate to monthly rents of $4,500 to $10,500 monthly. We have clients that live in the building that pay approximately $275 per month for the same exact room. So obviously, these are well in excess of the appropriate monthly legal rents. Further, an appellate court has recently ordered the owners of the Imperial Court to discontinue short-term rentals as they're violating the multiple dwelling law when they do so. The Imperial Court stands to make such an excess of funds by engaging in this illegal short-term rental business, they have yet to discontinue the nightly rentals, and tenants report that they see new guests checking in on a daily basis. You will hear from some of these tenants during public testimony regarding the illegal practice of their landlord. SRO owners use websites like Airbnb to rent out rent-stabilized rooms to unsuspecting tourists. And indeed, the illegal renting of affordable units through Airbnb has become such a significant problem that in 2014, the Attorney General issued subpoenas for lists of hosts who may be breaking the law by renting to permanent units on a transient basis. He later issued a report showing that 72% of all Airbnb rentals in New York City are illegal, and that commercial users control a disproportionate share of rentals. That is, 6% of hosts supply 36% of units and earn 37% of the revenue. This report that he issued doesn't solely talk about SROs, it does include apartments as well, but it is still compelling evidence that owners stand to profit by renting to short-term guests rather than to permanent tenants. Another way SRO owners are able to make these exorbitant profits and keep affordable units off the market are to warehouse either units or single units or entire buildings and keep them off the rental market. Owners refuse to rent to new tenants and units lie vacant for years. The purposes vary. Owners have kept units vacant for years in order to deregulate the units. Some owners keep buildings vacant so they can more easily obtain certificates of non-harassment, which allows them to convert to other uses. Other purposes, we don't know, but the effect is drastic and it's a harmful reduction of affordable SRO units in the city. What we do have is certainty that owners, by choice, do not maximize their rental income when they keep units vacant. They have a choice to rent them out. They choose not to for whatever reason, and they could be making money off of those. The effects of this widespread practice are exacerbating a housing affordability crisis for those that need it most. To give an idea of how widespread this warehousing issue is, looking only at our catchment area, which is the west side of Manhattan, 14th Street and North, if you're in a single-room occupancy building, we're aware of several buildings with large number of vacant units. A few of the more egregious examples are the aforementioned Imperial Court at 307 West 79th has approximately 63 permanent tenants housed in a building with 227 SRO units. The Hotel Alexander at 306 West 94th has 4 permanent tenants in a building with 114 units. And most egregiously, the Camden Hotel at 206 West 95th has 1 tenant left in a building with 207 units. Since the owners of these and other buildings with warehouse units are foregoing rents from permanent tenants, they certainly do not deserve a guidelines increase. Right. So rent increases for tenants cannot be justified in SRO buildings that are not fully occupied by permanent rent stabilized tenants or where the building's income is dependent primarily on sources other than its rent rolls. Many SRO buildings earn the vast majority of their income from sources other than renting to permanent rent stabilized tenants. Rental income from permanent tenants pales in comparison to income from lucrative city contracts, legally operated tourist hotels, and student dorm operations that are run in many SRO buildings. In the instances where there are no such operations, rental income could be increased by simply returning to the market all the warehouse units that currently sit vacant. Although you may be tempted to pass a proviso, such as the ones that were passed in the years prior to 2012 that permitted increases if buildings had a certain percentage of occupancy, no increase accompanied by a proviso for SROs is warranted this year. Based on our office's experiences, tenants have frequently had to bring complaints with the New York State DHCR, Division of Homes and Community Renewal, to challenge landlords' illegal increases under past provisos. In years when provisos have been in effect, our office has nonetheless had to challenge numerous illegal rent increases. The past 2 years, with 0% increases and no provisos, the number of illegal overcharge the past 3 years, with 0% rent increases and no provisos, the number of illegal overcharge complaints our office has seen has gone down drastically. Because of the widespread practice of warehousing and alternative uses of property that owners can make with their buildings, the majority of SRO buildings wouldn't meet the proviso anyway. The risk of similarly illegal increases with a proviso is high, and many tenants, fearing retaliation, will simply pay the increases without challenging them. And therefore, we encourage you to vote for a 0% increase for SROs and hotels without any proviso. I thank you for hearing my testimony, and I look forward to seeing you at future hearings.
Thank you.
I don't know, I may want to jump in. I'm sure you're going to talk about provisos going forward, or is that the only discussion?
A little bit.
A little bit. This board is not familiar with provisos, I don't think, as much because they did not vote on them.
I have them in my packet.
Okay.
I'll address them a little bit.
Yeah.
But essentially what Dan was speaking to for all board members, for new and for folks who joined us, the idea was that the board had voted a 0% increase. And for those units, when there was an increase in 2012, there was a proviso saying that 85% of the units had to be for permanent tenants in order to get that increase. If it was less than 85% of those units were not permanent, then they would get no increase. So when they talk about provisos, so the last time there was an increase granted by this board, that proviso went along with it. So just for clarification.
That was 2012?
2012.
I'll talk a little more about it.
Great. So I'm going to...
Dan has to
Yeah.
have intake for new clients Thursday, so Dan is going to leave to
Yeah.
Okay.
meet our new tenants. coming in.
Excellent. So I look forward to working with everybody here in the future, and thank you for hearing me.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Who's next?
That would be me. My name is Brian Sullivan. I'm a staff attorney at MFY Legal Services in our SRO law project. MFY is a legal services organization which envisions a society in which there is equal justice for all. To this end, we assist more than 20,000 New Yorkers each year. We've had a SRO project for 25 years in which we assist tenants who live in SRO buildings. Dan covered a lot of great ground there, and so I'm just going to fill in a few extra pieces here and there, and then I also want to talk a little bit about the changing housing market in New York City, especially over the past couple of years, and changes I think we can anticipate going forward. In terms of the basics of SRO housing, SRO tenants are amongst New York's poorest residents. They simply cannot afford rent increases. Many of them live on fixed income, many are elderly, many are veterans. I think Dan covered that ground very well. This is a very, very low income portion of the population. If they're not living in SROs, they're living in homeless shelters. And unfortunately, for many of our clients, it's that sharp a decision. You're either in this SRO or you're going to a shelter if you're evicted. SROs themselves are varied. There's sort of the large hotel-style SROs on the west side. Throughout Brooklyn, there's brownstones that were converted into rooming houses. So from the outside, it looks basically like a brownstone, but you go in and there's far more units than you might anticipate, with shared bathrooms, shared kitchens, that sort of thing. And then on the Bowery, there's huge loft spaces that are broken out into cubicles with chicken wire ceilings. So it's a really varied form of housing. And again, the main thing that unites this housing is it's occupied by very low-income people who cannot afford to pay more in rent. As Dan covered, SRO owners really don't need a rent increase, and I think he covered the ground there well. They find many other profitable uses for their buildings. So he talked about running legal hotels, which you're allowed to do in some SROs, running illegal hotels, contracts with the Department of Homeless Services. We don't see this as much, but it's still, I think, an important phenomenon, which is some SROs will be given over to three-quarter houses, where an unscrupulous nonprofit organization will come in and essentially have a location from which to conduct Medicaid fraud. And they'll force tenants to go to a certain health provider, and use their Medicaid payments that they get through that to supplement their income at the building. This continues to be a problem. This year, I'm sure Larry will talk about it more, and I'm sure you guys have heard very much about this over the past couple of days, but the operating cost of owners is exceptionally low this year, and is particularly low for SRO owners. I believe the figure is negative 3.8%. So this has not been an expensive year for owners of SRO buildings. So all the factors that in the past have argued in favor of a 0% increase are present, and in fact, if anything, more present this year than they've ever been. The question of the changing housing market, I think, is an important one for us to address. So especially in upzoned areas of the city, but really all across the city, there's a lot of pressure on landlords to increase rents, and sort of unique ability or market room to increase rents. A rent freeze for SROs is a uniquely good tool for advancing the mayor's goal of preserving 120,000 units. The new housing that's going to be developed as part of the various affordable housing initiatives, unfortunately, largely will not be affordable to SRO tenants. And again, this is because we're talking about many people who live on $800 a month from Social Security, and new housing is just not being constructed in that price range. The SROs, however, are some of the only housing in New York City that do fall in that price range. And so a 0% increase for those tenants that do live in SROs, and although we don't see it as much as 10 years ago, people do move into SROs new. A lot of SRO tenants have been there a long time, but people are moving in. Keeping those rents low preserves the only housing affordable to the people at the very, very bottom end of the market, people living on exceedingly low incomes. I guess Larry will talk a little more about the proviso, but I think particularly looking at the outer boroughs, as I mentioned, there are a number of SROs that are located in sort of brownstones, that sort of thing. Many of those buildings would not benefit from the proviso. Those buildings do tend to be full. They are full, there are only maybe 10 units or something like that, so it's not the sort of large hotel-style buildings, but those tenants would all face increases if even if the proviso was passed, or even if the proviso was part of the board's order this year. And these are amongst the most vulnerable tenants. These tend to be very long-term tenants who've been living in these buildings for a very long time. they would have nowhere else to go. And when the SRO market collapsed in the 70s and 80s, there was a spike in homelessness then, and we're still sort of living with that legacy now. And it's not something the city could afford to have happen right now. There is fortunately much new funding for legal services. And just to take an example of one of these outer borough buildings, we represent a tenant in a building near one of the upzoned areas where the landlord just brought a series of pretty clearly frivolous cases. And if you put more resources into attorneys to defend people in those situations, we'll be able to beat back those frivolous cases. However, our clients living in those buildings would not be able to afford a rent increase. And there would be nothing I could do, no matter how hard I fought, to roll back that rent increase if it were to happen. And so the resources being put into preserving housing are vital and very helpful for low-income New Yorkers. However, what this board does with the SRO, SRO increases will be equally vital, and in fact is uniquely well situated to preserve this section of the market. So we thank you very much for hearing our testimony this year and urge the board, given that situation has not changed in meaningful ways, or to the extent that it has, actually more strongly favors a 0% increase for SRO tenants this year.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Okay.
Mr. Wood.
I guess I'm batting clean up here. So I have a packet that has a lot of different things in it.
Yes.
And this is some of the data, whatever we have available to help document what both Dan and Brian has put forth to you. So the first item in that packet is actually from the RGB itself. It's the explanatory statement for the hotel orders. If you just look at the second page there, under definitions, Brian referred to the different types of SROs. Some hotels were built as hotels, Class A or Class B hotels, but many were converted buildings, big apartment buildings that might have been broken up in the 1920s or 30s into SROs, one or two family buildings broken up into rooming houses. So there's actually 5 categories of SROs, and which is interesting. They don't break apartment buildings up, and obviously we have a great variety of apartment buildings. But this gives you the sense, both the residential Class A hotels, which AC lives in one, and you'll hear from her at the public hearings, and then you have Class B hotels, the lodging houses, they're famous in the Bowery, the big long lofts with the chicken wire, cubicles basically with chicken wire roofs. The units are small. You need 80 square feet for single, for one person, 130 for two. I always laugh when I hear people describe the micro apartments being so tiny at 300 square feet. They'll be palatial for a lot of the clients, a lot of our tenants that we work with in SROs. So just to give you the sense, going back to the first page where it says special note, this is the footnote that's left from the prior provisos. And I included the chart of all the RGB adjustments that have been approved going back to the inception in the 70s. The first proviso was back in '84 around the issue of warehousing. And the argument was if the landlord really needs rental income, he should rent all the empty units first before they would qualify for a guideline increase. And then we got provisos when we were able to document that substantial portions of these buildings were being rented out at great profit, and because the building was so profitable, it didn't warrant a rent increase those particular years. So that just gives you, the background of those provisos. The next notice I wanted to look at, it's a separate piece of paper I gave you. It just says notice of duties of hotels and tenants. When you rent a room in an SRO, you're not rent stabilized from the get-go. You become a permanent tenant automatically after 6 months. The owners are supposed to give you this notice. We don't know any owner who's ever given it out, but you're supposed to be told that you're in a room that's subject to rent stabilization, and there's a provision to trigger your rights to become a permanent tenant anytime after you've rented the room. So I can rent a room for a week as a tourist, and if I know that the room is subject to stabilization, you do what's called a lease request. You don't get a lease, and it's not a request. It triggers your rights to become a permanent tenant. And because they legally can rent to transients for those first 6 months. That's what's opened the door for all of these other profitable rentals. Renting to colleges, college students need affordable housing. The city, with the special needs populations, are desperate to find shelter space, so they've been renting out SROs at great profit. And of course, the tourist rentals. Some SROs can do short-term rentals. If they're in a commercial zone, they have to fight fire regulations, but many of them do it illegally. A lot of SROs are in non-commercial residential neighborhoods, and they should not be doing tourist rentals. But that's we've called it the transiency loophole, and we've always been trying to get that addressed, but we've never been successful at getting Albany to change the law. But that's how it works in SROs. You're a transient tenant until you've done a lease request or after 6 months. So how many SROs are out there? The next page in that packet is from DHCR. Historically, back in 1971, there was estimates of 165,000 units of SRO housing in the city. The city saw it as substandard housing and encouraged the demolition and conversion of SROs. J51 subsidies were frequently used by owners to upgrade their property. And throughout the 70s, there was really a Wild West atmosphere, and landlords were really using almost any means necessary to empty a lot of SROs. An SRO Tenants' Rights Coalition formed that led to the creation of offices and the like. 15 years later, in 1986, the city had a one-year moratorium on the demolition and conversion of SROs, and there was a Blackburn report determined how many were left, and they found 65,000 left in 1986. So over 15 years, from 71 to 86, two-thirds of the stock, about 100,000 units were lost. So it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out why homelessness was spiking in the 80s when you lose two-thirds of your SRO stock. The city's been doing its utmost to try to preserve that housing, and that's our mission, is to protect the rights of tenants in those buildings and to keep them as affordable rent-regulated units. Current estimates are hard. No one's done a new report. We estimate 30 to 40,000 maybe. DHCR, though, can give you a number of how many are actually registered with the state. We think there's a lot of underreporting of that, but this memo from DHCR, if you look at the second page, in 2009, it was 22,000 units registered with the state, and 2012, 21,000. So basically, between 20, 25 have been registered with DHCR on an annual basis, and we think that's underreported. We think there are more than that. The thing that's also kind of astounding, if you look at the question 19, what is the average medium rent? $2,200 for medium rent? The average rent was listed as $2,200. The medium rent was $1,200 a month. It's incredible how they're registering these units. Sometimes it's a reflection of transient rents that they're registering, or I don't know how they get such high figures. It's really unfathomable. The next little thing in that packet, this was a study that Dan referred to from Community Board 7. It really gives you a good overview of what happened just in Community Board 7 with the SRO housing stock. Community Board 7 is from 59th Street to 110th Street on the west side. So just flipping through the questions, like what are SROs, how many are left in Community Board 7, how many have been lost, how are they used. So they go through some of the definitions. I just want to go to just the fourth page in. They found in Community Board 7 there were 13,364 B units. Hotels, student housing, servants' quarters and luxury buildings, nonprofit-supported SROs, and then traditional SROs. The next there is a little pie chart showing you the breakdown of those units in Community Board 7. I put letters next to them because the color doesn't come out in black and white, but you can see the number of legal use SROs, D, 3,200, a little over 3,000, is dwarfed by the E, the illegal hotel and the city placements, up in Community Board 7. Nonprofits had about 2,000 units up in Community Board 7. The next couple of charts, they estimate how many units were lost. There's a process when owners are going to convert SRO back into an apartment building or put it back into a one or two family house. They have to get a certificate of non-harassment before they can get an alteration permit. They look back at a 3-year window to see if there's any history of harassment in emptying that building. And if there is a finding harassment, then the owner can't get any permits to convert the building. So it's through looking at how many certificate of non-harassments were approved that the community board got estimates on the lost units. The next page there is showing you where some of those lost units were based on those CONHs. You can see it's scattered throughout the Upper West Side. Units have continued to be lost and converted. The next chart there, pie chart, shows you a breakdown of the market-driven B units in Community Board 7, both alleged illegal use, city placements, and the like. The next chart there shows illegal hotels. That was as of when this report was created. Some of those buildings are not being used as illegal hotels, but some are still persisting. Imperial Court, you can see down there on 79th Street, it's a great example. Despite losing a court decision saying they could not do short-term rentals, they're still going full speed ahead. It's so profitable to continue to do so. The fines are just going to be a cost of doing business. The mayor's enforcement office went out and wrote up 57 rooms were being used illegally. They'll pay fines on those, but they're going to make so much more money continuing to do tourist rentals. So we're going to have to increase the fines so the cost of doing business doesn't make it a good business plan to continue to operate illegally. The next page here, this again was as of when this report was created, but it's still a practice. The city's still turning to SROs for placement of special need rentals at great profit to these owners. And the city is desperate. They really are looking for places to house people in the shelter system. And we need, obviously, to create more permanent housing and to get folks back into these warehoused and SROs that are not being used appropriately. So that gives you some data. The next packet of stuff, the staff here, Andrew, has done a number of memos. There's 5 memos between 2007 and 2015. The first memo was done, I think, as a request of one of the owner reps years ago. They wanted to understand the impact of the provisos and how many SROs would not qualify for an increase based on warehousing or significant non-rent stabilized rentals. So I'm not going to go through each memo, but you have that as a packet. The legal size piece of paper that you have, I tried to pull out the essential data from those memos to give you kind of an idea. On the left side of that chart, this is actually the last time we actually got some data from the Housing and Vacancy Survey. They don't have enough of a database to give you information anymore, but so it's very dated, but it gives you a sense of, in 96 and 2002, some information about SROs, who lives in them. You can see it by the numbers. Between 47% were African American, Hispanic, white. The income breakdown, mean and medium rents. So that's an old chart, and then I've updated on the right side is the information I gleaned from the memos that the RGB created. So the first line up there is how many units have been registered with the HCR, and I think, again, that's a conservative number. I think there's more SROs more units out there. So it's how many units in how many buildings. There were issues, and Andrew may be able to explain it with the data. So like some apartment buildings registered themselves as SROs. So he tried to pull that out to, is that correct, Andrew? Yeah.
Yeah, we try to clean the data when we can, because there's certain things that when we're looking through the buildings, like a trigger will say, well, this doesn't seem right. And I know one, you'll find an entire building with 300 units that's an apartment building, but registered as a SRO, and their rents are, the average rent or median rent is $2,500. So we try to take those out where we can.
Right, thank you.
So,
So that, I mean, that gives you a sense of the units. How many were exempt? That means not being used as rent-stabilized units. And remember, the proviso, the percent has changed. It used to be 50% and 30%, and the latest provisos were 15% or more deregulated or not being used as rent-stabilized. A proviso took effect. So the percent of those units that were exempt, not being used as rent-stabilized, has climbed. It was 26.8 in the 2005 memo. The latest memo from 2014, we were approaching 40% of the units were not being rented as rent-stabilized. So it's pretty significant. And usually when you had one exempt unit, you usually had a lot in the buildings that applied. On the bottom, I pulled out the mean and medium rents as well. You can see how high they are. The memos also show, there's a breakdown by borough, and the median and medium rents for SROs was cheaper in Manhattan than the outer boroughs, which was a strange phenomena, but I think that's kind of a reflection of some of the big SROs where there's long-term tenants and has been an organizing presence for a long time. We've been able to maintain those tenancies and keep the rents at the proper legal registered rate. And maybe some of the brownstones and rooming houses in the outer boroughs haven't had the same organizing, and the people might not know their rights. They often don't have leases. They think they're month-to-month tenants, and I think there's a lot more overcharging has gone on, and that's what's brought up the mean and median rents outside of Manhattan. So that's that data. And then I just want to close with, this is something I shared last year. Create 21-foot wide single-family mansion can be delivered vacant. So this is an SRO, a building on the Upper West Side. The back page is a certificate of occupancy. It was converted to a rooming house in 1920. They were advertised as bachelor apartments, but there were 9 studios and 8 B units. They have their certificate of non-harassment, so that's why they're advertising you can convert it back to a single-family mansion. The thing, if you look at the second page, they have a breakdown of the rent roll. It's hard to believe this, but this is what I guess you can get for studio apartments on the Upper West Side. They have the status. FM is free market. SR means rent stabilized. So one tenant is paying $829.67. So the tenant's been there a long time. There's another SRO tenant in room 16 paying $974. Oh, no, actually it's listed as vacant. The one tenant, he actually works at a senior center. He's a porter at a nearby senior center. I met him recently. He told me that he'd been offered buyouts many times and he hasn't moved, and he told me the address. I said, oh, I know your building. So, but you can look at this rent roll. The net operating income, $270,000 on a gross income of $374. The next page shows you the estimated operating expenses, $103,000. It's a very, very profitable building at those rents. The thing to think about SROs and the way they're broken up, on a square foot basis, they're much cheaper to operate when you have shared bathrooms and shared kitchens, instead of a bathroom and kitchen in every unit. And on a square foot basis, they're making a lot more money than you're going to get in an apartment building. So this building is an example of a brownstone on the Upper West Side that it's just enormously profitable. This person's not relying on RGB increases, and they probably have operated outside that system for quite some time. I'm sure some of those market rate, free market tenants are being overcharged and probably do rent rollbacks.
Do you have any idea, if I could just ask, what percentage of SROs are operating at full, with permanent residents who are rent stabilized? In other words, do we have, any SROs, or what percentage are?
Very, very, very few. I think Brian referred to some of the ones in the outer boroughs, some rooming houses and the like. The only ones that are still full are the ones that have been acquired by nonprofits. We want all these SROs to be preserved. We need these operators to stop their warehousing, to stop the illegal use. But most of the big SROs in Manhattan, I don't know any that's just a full SRO anymore. Some of them have significant numbers of tenants left, but they've become naturally occurring retirement communities in some respects in Newark, because the remaining tenants have aged in place. And when there's a vacancy, if they can rent it to the city, they can net lease it to Columbia University, Teachers College, they're going to do so. Even the best owner who doesn't harass, they're going to try to maximize their income. And if they can do tourist rentals, that's what they're going to do.
Is any new SRO housing being built?
No, SROs, in 1954, you couldn't build new SROs. It was seen as substandard housing. So that's why we've been slowly attriting them away. The exception is nonprofits. I guess
Right.
a dormitory basically is an SRO. So schools can build SROs, nonprofits can build SROs, but right now the private sector can't. There's actually, I didn't bring it, but there's a report that was done a number of years ago. They're estimating there's more illegal SROs in New York City right now than remaining legal ones. You've heard reference to the three-quarter housing. Many one- or two-family houses in Queens, where we have a huge immigrants have moved to the city, have basement apartments that are not legal. Buildings still get subdivided up. We don't condone fire traps. We've actually advocated for allowing new SRO construction. The city has looked at it from time to time, but it hasn't happened. But
What
we
about
would like
new
to...
SRO construction by nonprofits? I mean, in other words, you know, nonprofit-sponsored.
Well, nonprofits can do it if they get funding, and there's some hope. I mean, both the mayor and the governor are committed to creating 35,000 units of new supported housing over the next 10 years. So that's going to be some capital money for nonprofits to build new SROs, or to preserve some. But the illegal ones that are out there, many of them might be able to be brought up to code if they were allowed to. And we'd like to encourage the private sector to... These can be profitable buildings, even as, you know, rent-regulated buildings. If they get the right type of subsidy or mortgage break, even the private sector can build new SROs. But maybe that's something the city will look at. They're cracking down every once in a while. There's a tragedy, a fireman gets hurt in a legal building, they want to crack down and enforce, but you got to look at where you can bring things up to code and make them safe at the same time, because we have such an acute housing shortage. We got to preserve every unit we can.
The one thing I'll add to that, 'cause Larry really covered the ground there, you do see renovation in SROs from time to time, very, very few new units, but the private sector is building new SROs, they're just illegal. There are a lot, and it's a little outside what this board has any control over. We're outside, you can't regulate the rents in those illegal SROs. I raise it just to underscore that SROs are frequently talked about as irrelevant housing or a relic of the past. This is in no way the case. There are, as Larry said, possibly, in fact, likely more illegal SROs than legal SROs, because there is such demand for this housing. And so it continues to be a very, very vital part of the New York City housing market, and frequently misunderstood in exactly this respect. And so...
Just explain what are being built that are illegal?
So, for example, I was on intake earlier today, and a gentleman walked in who lives in a two-family home in East New York that's been subdivided into 12 different units. And these are being rented out as SRO units at the rent of approximately $450 per room. We haven't been able to sort of put together a study on this so far, although we're exploring that, but there are, Chaya, which is an organization in Queens, estimated there are, I believe they said 170,000 illegal units in the city, and I would not be surprised if that's an understatement. They say 170,000 illegal units housing as many as 500,000 New Yorkers, and I would not be surprised if there's actually significantly more than that.
Yeah, we have a report that was done a number of years ago by some urban planners, Jill Hamburg and others, who really laid out how many illegal SROs. It's about 10 years old at this point, but at that point, they were also estimating there were greater number of illegal units than legal units right now. But we want to preserve those legal units. That's our focus here today. That's why we're seeking the zero guideline once again.
Are there any questions for our panel?
I can address your question about.
All right.
So from our most current memo, which was done in May of last year, there were 529 buildings registered with DHCR. as being some type of SRO hotel. 52 of these buildings consist of entirely exempt and/or vacant units, and 214 buildings, or 40%, contain less than 85% permanently stabilized units. That would leave about a balance of 263 buildings that registered with the HCR,
And presumably have more than 85.
have more than 85%.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Wow.
So I guess in closing, we request a meeting with the new members, particularly Your Honor. We'd love an opportunity to meet with you, and we can go over a lot of the data in more detail, if you're willing. And any other members who would like to have a meeting with us, we'd welcome the opportunity to share the data, the information, and I can bring some of these other reports to document what we've presented.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn happily.
All right.
We
We are adjourned.
We have to second it.
Yes, there's a second, and we are adjourned.